Hey YouTube, what's up? Abyssalwave here, and welcome to my 735 Frost DK guide. Now, if you want to skip the intro and everything, and you want to see a specific part of the video, I'm going to put timestamps on the screen right now, so you can go to any part of the videos that you want to see, or you just want to skip over my rambling at the beginning of the video, then by all means, go ahead and do that. So it has been a long road of Legion. We start off with Unholy DKs being number 1 in Emerald Nightmare at the start, and Frost DKs took over in Trials of Valor and Nighthold, and were dominant for a while, but then when Tomb of Sargeras came out, Unholy DKs took the crown again, and by a pretty dominant amount. But nowadays, Frost DKs are currently number 1 overall for DKs. However, it has ended up being very close. Unholy DKs are not far behind at all, by just a tiny bit lower than Frost overall. But they have a ton of bursts. If you like a class with a lot of bursts and a little bit of RNG involved, Unholy DKs may be the class for you. But this video is about Frost DKs. Let's get into it right now. So we're going to start off the guide by talking about the top 3 races for both Alliance and Horde. So for Alliance, number 1 is Dwarf. The reason being is you get plus 2% crit damage as a Dwarf. Number 2 is Human, and the reason it's Human is because you get 2% extra secondary stats from all sources. So basically what that means is if a piece of gear gives me 100 mastery, I'm going to get 102 mastery from it after all of that human racial stuff is said and done. And it doesn't sound like a lot, but when you have 10,000 mastery, that amounts to an extra 200 mastery. That's kind of big. That's actually a lot. So that's why Human is in the spot it is. And for Gnome, you get plus 1% haste, and also you get plus 5% to your max resource, which for us DKs is runic power, which is nice. It's not crazy or anything. It's nice. The plus 1% haste is phenomenal though. Now for Horde, number 1 is Torn, which is the exact same as Dwarf. They get the 2% crit damage. So the reason why that is so strong, and I should have said this for Dwarf, but I'm saying it now. The reason why the 2% crit damage is so big is because thanks to Killing Machine, you are critting a lot. You are critting a lot. So getting an extra 2% crit damage onto that is very big. And not just that, everything in general. But it's the same reason why the artifact trait Nothing But the Boots, the one that gives 6% obliterate crit damage, is so strong. It's the number 2 Netherlight Crucible, or just talent in general. Not talent, but artifact trait in general, because of how the build works now with obliteration, and just the fact that some people are getting 70 to 80% crit chance on their obliterate. It's huge. It's insane. And that's why Torn and Dwarves are so strong. So for number 2 on Horde, we have Trolls, which have a really nice cooldown called Berserking, which gives them 15% haste for 10 seconds, which is big. 15% haste, that's a little less than half of a Bloodlust. So getting that, which I see a lot of them pop after Bloodlust. It's kind of like having a slightly extended Bloodlust. Some people pop it during Bloodlust, however you want to do it, whichever nets you the best results. But it's a very strong racial. And third is Blood Elf. It's kind of fallen off a bit since the Breath build is no longer the best build, and Unholy is not the best spec anymore for DPS. Just, it's not number 1. It's still a phenomenal spec though. So Blood Elf, the reason why it's third and still above the other classes is because it does give you always that plus 1 crit chance, and you have an awesome racial called Arcane Torrent. It's what makes them so damn strong in Mythic Plus. The ability to AoE silence is very strong, especially in a class that lacks movement. As DKs do, the ability to bring in a AoE silence is enormous. It really is. And it can lead to you being able to do big pulls in Mythic Plus. And it's one of the most popular classes we see in something like the MDI or just Mythic Plus pushing in general. And it also generates you 20 runic power, so it's really nice on bosses to get that extra 20 runic power. It's great. So now we're on to the big part of the video, which is the talent breakdown. So first off, we're going to start with the tier 56. And of course, in this tier, we've seen on sites like Warcraft Logs, Icy Veins, and others
that Shattering Strikes is king. And the reason Shattering Strikes is king is because it simply adds a lot more damage now with the buff from 40% additional damage to 60% additional damage. It's a lot stronger now, and when used correctly and with tier 21 4-piece, which for those of you who don't know, tier 21 4-piece, the proc from it actually applies Razor Ice with each of its 3 hits, so it's very strong to synergize with that, which makes it just a phenomenal talent to take because you're getting more Razor Ices in the fight with tier 21, which allows you to get more of these buffed Frost Strikes. Now, I'll outline this later in the video, and I'll go over how to efficiently use Shattering Strikes to its fullest potential. That'll be done during the rotation outline portion of the video, so you can go back to the beginning of the video and look for the time to skip ahead to that. But let's move on to Icy Talents. Now, for those of you who did not play Frost back in Emerald Nightmare and also in Trials of Valor, Icy Talons was the go-to talent, and it kind of made this build called the Machine Gun build. Now, this build was awful to play because you had to maintain Icy Talons the entire time. And it used to be 10 seconds, now it's, or not 10 seconds, but 10%. Now it's 12%, which is a little bit higher, but this talent is not the strongest talent. It is not even second. It is the 3rd strongest talent on this tier, and simply the reason why it is just not a go-to talent anymore is because it is annoying to keep up. It really is, and it doesn't add enough damage compared to things like Shattering Strikes and Runic Attenuation to make up for how difficult it is to keep up all of the time. And then lastly in the tier we have Runic Attenuation. This is a passive talent. Obviously you can see from it saying passive, and it does add a decent amount of runic power to an overall fight, no matter how long the fight is. And the good thing about this talent is it is a phenomenal talent for DKs who are just coming to the spec and don't know how to really play with Shattering Strikes yet. I am going to again outline Shattering Strikes later in the video, but if you're very new to Frost and you're not comfortable with Shattering Strikes, you're not going to lose a lot of DPS at all by playing Runic Attenuation. Now for the 57 tier, the default choice in this tier is Murderous Efficiency. And the reason it's Murderous Efficiency, even though it was nerfed from 65% back down to 50% that it was back in EN, is because it is simply a very strong talent. Passive effects that can do something like this are generally very strong, and it outperforms the other talent, and since it takes really no extra effort to think about or do something with, like Horn of Winter, it is generally known to be a stronger talent because it just takes less effort, and it also just sims higher anyway. So just a very strong talent and a really nice choice. Horn of Winter is good. It won't outperform Murderous Efficiency because it also got a slight nerf. It went from 30 seconds to 45 seconds. It's still an alright talent and does have a place in a Breath of Sindragosa AoE build that is still possible, and on heavy AoE fights is maybe going to outperform Obliteration, but in this build we would rather go for Murderous Efficiency. It's going to, in general, generate more resources in a fight with an Obliteration-centered build, and it is just easier to manage and maintain, which is just really nice. Freezing Fog has really fallen from grace since patch 7.2, when it received a nerf from 30% to 20%, and they kind of changed a little bit about how Howling Blast works. It's a little bit of a tongue twister right there, but it just won't get as much use as it used to. And if you only have the legendary helmet, you can look at using this talent, but in general, you probably won't want to anyway. But if that is your only legendary, sim it and see if Freezing Fog does sim higher. It's possible. In the 58 tier, the choice here is Ice Cap that you're going to see from 99% of DKs. However, Avalanche is still a very good talent. We can rule out Glacial Advance. It sucks. It is a terrible talent. It was okay back in the day when the choices were this or the weaker version of Obliteration. Now that it's in a tier with 2 very strong talents, it is just not going to be a choice anymore. Avalanche is still a fairly strong talent, and since it is a passive that doesn't change how you play at all, it is very strong and great for new players. If you don't like how Ice Cap can offset the cooldown alignment of your abilities between Obliteration and Pillar of Frost, then by all means play Avalanche. You're probably not going to lose a lot of damage, maybe a couple 10,000 damage here and there. However, if you are looking to min-max your damage to the fullest and learn how to really get everything out of the Frost DK spec, Ice Cap is in general going to be a better choice, because the ability to get an extra Pillar of Frost in a fight is absolutely phenomenal. It really is, and will generally beat out Avalanche by a margin. But again, Avalanche is a great choice for new players just learning the spec. Now I'm just going to briefly go over the next two tiers because they do not add a significant amount of DPS. This tier does not add any. Tier 75 adds very little, if any. So for tier 60, the choices are completely up to you guys on what you would prefer. I personally usually prefer Winter is Coming, because a straight out stun, especially for as long as 4 seconds, is amazing on some fights. That's fights like Agrimar, where that is kind of a big deal, and really that's it. There's not many other fights where you're looking to freeze anything. I can't really think of another one off the top of my head, but in Mythic Plus this is generally a very good talent, although a talent like Blinding Sleet, which is on demand and instant, although it may only disorient, is still a good talent. Abomination's Might is not great. It's okay in PvP. It's not great in PvE, though. Now we'll go on to tier 75, which is a utility tier that actually adds some form of DPS in spots. So on this tier, you have a choice of all three. And I'll go over different situations where each one will be very good. So Volatile Shielding is phenomenal on fights like Garrothi or such other fights where you're looking to really maximize damage by staying in and taking maybe a little bit of a bigger hit than you normally would. Maybe taking a little bit more of that, I forget what that big explosion is called, that he does when he pulls enemies in. But if you're looking to take a little bit more than that, not want to run away, Volatile Shielding is phenomenal. It's great on fights where you want that extra DPS, but you're not going to be away from the boss. Because if you're going to be away from the boss, your chances are going to be running Inexorable Assault. So Volatile Shielding is phenomenal on a fight like Veramathras, where you have only a chance to be away from the boss. But on a fight like Iminar or Garrothi, where you're going to be away for a little, but especially on a fight like Iminar or Kingaroth, Inexorable Assault gains a ton of value and can actually add up to a significant chunk of your DPS on especially a fight like Iminar, where you're constantly running across the bridge every minute or so. That is a ton of damage. Inexorable Assault is a phenomenal talent on those fights where you're away from the boss for a decent time. I'm not saying even a long period, just a decent amount of time. Only a little bit. You only really need to get 1 to 2 million damage from Inexorable Assault for it to beat out Volatile Shielding. You can easily do that on Garrothi. And on fights like Iminar, Kingaroth, you're going to be getting into the 10 millions of Inexorable Assault. I've seen Inexorable Assaults for 20 mil on Iminar. It's crazy, actually. Now in tier 90, we have an interesting choice. So first off, Frost Scythe is really only taken in AoE fights or cleave fights where it gains significant benefit from being the choice over something like Gathering Storm. Gathering Storm and Frozen Pulse are both better on single target than Frost Scythe, of course. However, between Frozen Pulse and Gathering Storm, the choice is generally going to be Gathering Storm for the more experienced players. If you're newer to the spec, Frozen Pulse will generally be just an easier talent to play with. However, let's talk a little bit about Gathering Storm. So some important things to know about this, and we'll get into this more in the rotation part of the video. But a really important thing about Gathering Storm is before Remorseless comes off cooldown, you want to start pulling a couple runes, usually about 3 or more runes, so you can immediately get started with stacking up your Gathering Storm stacks. And also another thing with Remorseless Winter, we have something called Frozen Pulse, which a lot of people I know forget about. But every time you clip an enemy with a Remorseless Winter, you gain a stack of Frozen Soul, and at the end of your Gathering Storm, it explodes and deals damage, stacking up to as many times as you hit enemies. And also, another important thing that Gathering Storm gives us the opportunity to do, and this is really only possible if you get decent RNG, and it is entirely possible during Lust, is if you actually get to the point where your Remorseless is coming off cooldown, but you still have a Remorseless going, clicking Remorseless keeps the Gathering Storm stacks and just refreshes the duration of Remorseless Winter. It's actually a phenomenal thing, and it can lead to some crazy DPS on some raid bosses where you lust on pull, and just in general later on if you start pulling your resources before a Remorseless Winter and before Lust comes out, you can also get those huge overlaps. It was a lot more possible during the Breath of Sindragosa, where Hungry Rune Weapon was a really nice synergy. Now it's a lot harder, but still entirely possible. And Frozen Pulse, of course, if you're playing that, you want to stay on as low runes as possible as much of the time, which leads to you dumping a lot of runes, and actually it's sometimes hoping you don't get a lot of runic empowerment procs, but at the same time you do. It's weird. It's a fun talent to play with. It used to be the best talent back in Emerald Nightmare. Nowadays, it just can't beat Gathering Storm at the high level of play. But if you're just getting into the spec, try it out if you don't like Gathering Storm, and you can still amount to a decent amount of damage. And if your best legendary is the talent ring, you can run Gathering Storm and Frozen Pulse and get a decent amount of single target damage out of running both of them. Last but not least, we have the talent that makes this all possible, and that is Obliteration. Now, for Breath of Sindragosa and Hungry and Rune Weapon, I'm going to make guides on those in separate videos. We're only going to be talking about Obliteration in this video, although the other two are viable in their own situations. Not so much Hungry and Rune Weapon, but Breath is, so we'll talk about that separately. So for Obliteration, for those of you who don't know how it works, basically for 10 seconds, it makes any Frost Strike or Howling Blast you use, that includes Howling Blast that have Rhyme procs, grant you a Killing Machine. And also, all of your Obliterates cost one less rune. That includes Obliterates that have a Killing Machine proc. And another thing with this is if you are running Murderous Efficiency, which if you're running this build, chances are you are running Murderous Efficiency, you can just have at times Obliterate cost that one rune and then give that rune back, and then it's like you didn't use a rune at all. It's pretty awesome actually, and this build does provide a decent amount of single target burst, because getting those constant Killing Machine procs at the beginning of a fight can lead to some actually crazy DPS, and we've seen some Frost DKs do some ridiculous numbers so far compared to the rest of their guild in the high-end guilds. Next up, we have the top 3 legendaries for the build and why they are the top 3 legendaries for the build. So number 1, we have Torvin's White Owl Bindings. These have been just an incredible legendary since Emerald Nightmare, when Frost got its huge buff, and I think it was 7-1-5 or something like that, 7-1, something along those lines. Halfway through Emerald Nightmare, when Frost got that big buff, Torvin's took over as one of the best legendaries for DKs in general. It is a phenomenal legendary. Stacks with that 10% artifact trait for Frost damage that we already get as Frost, that we get very early on, which means during Pillar of Frost, you're going to get 25% Frost damage if you're wearing Torvin's and have that artifact trait. That's a lot of Frost damage. And with Frost damage being a vast majority of our damage, this legendary is phenomenal. It is amazing. Number 2, we have Koltir's Newfound Will. So the reason that this is so good nowadays is because they did change the legendary from 15% to refund 2 runes to 15% to refund 1 rune. However, they did add in 10% Obliterate damage onto it as kind of a passive when you're wearing the legendary, which is amazing because Obliterate is a huge chunk of our damage. It's usually about tied with Frost Strike now if you're running Shattering Strikes, which means a 10% additive damage on to that huge chunk of damage that you already have is just amazing. It really is. And the refund rune is just an added bonus that makes this legendary phenomenal. And then number 3, we have Cold Heart. Now, Cold Heart does have its own build based around getting the most out of the legendary, and that really just relies around min-maxing when to use Cold Heart. Let's say you're dropping Pillar of Frost and you're at about 17 stacks. You're going to want to use your Cold Heart, you know, that kind of thing. I'll make a separate video on that later about how to min-max this legendary, but if you're just using it at 20 stacks no matter what, it's still going to do a ton of damage.
So it's just an awesome legendary no matter what. And it can be better than the belt if you have a really shitty chest and have a good belt. Like, for instance, when I had a 945 chest, but I bonus rolled the 980 belt off of Agrimar, my best sim setup was Bracer's chest, believe it or not. And that just goes to show how strong this chest still is for Frost. Even though we don't have as crazy mastery as Unholy DKs do, this chest is still amazing. So sim yourself if you have a similar setup to that, or if you don't have Bracers or Belt yet, but you have Cold Heart, sim yourself, see what's best for you. And if you do have the same kind of situation as me, you might be running the chest and still do a ton of damage. So now onto the trinket section of the video. So before I really get into the trinkets, I'd like to kind of take the Pantheon trinkets and talk about them first, because I'm not really going to be putting them into a ranking system or anything, because they're just number one. They are. They're just the best, and there's no point in comparing them to other trinkets, because when you get Khazgrat to 1k, and if you ever get Aman'Thuls to drop, you're going to use them. That's just it. You're going to use them. Even if no one else in your raid is using them, you're still going to use a 1k trinket. That's ridiculous. The amount of stats they give are stupid. But let's get into the actual trinkets that, well, I know Khazgrat is a very high chance to get, but you got to upgrade it each week. But let's talk about the other trinkets. So Shadow Singed Fang. This trinket is phenomenal for Frost. It is amazing. We're a dual wielding class, which means we have a decent attack speed, but because we value all of our stats about equally, we don't have one that we put heavily into or over the others. This trinket is amazing because it just gives a ton of stats. And the uptime on it is actually crazy high. It has for me personally, and for a lot of other DKs near the top level, we have approximately a 70 to 80% uptime on this trinket compared to others. And that just gives us a crazy amount of stats over a fight, meaning this trinket is just awesome. And because we're a class that don't care about burst, we don't care about our burst. Our burst is not going to be as high as a class like a rogue or a spec like a windwalker. We're just not going to burst like that. So we don't care about proc trinkets. They don't proc on pull. That's no big deal at all. They do? Great. They proc during our another burst session? Great. They don't? That's fine. That's kind of how a philosophy of Frost DKs work with the current Obliteration build. And then we have Seeping Scourgewing. This trinket is not awful. It doesn't suck hard, but there are so many other better trinkets you can get for Frost. The reason you see classes like Retribution Paladins and Unholy DKs using this trinket is because their attack speed is heavy during their burst. For instance, Unholy DKs, during your big burst, when you use your Apocalypse to pop a lot of wounds, not runes, you have a ton of attack speed from Unholy Frenzy. You have that 100% increased attack speed for 20 to 30 seconds. And during that time, this trinket will proc a decent amount of the time. Quite a bit, actually. Meaning this trinket is very strong for them. For Retribution Paladins, they have Crusade. That's an extra 45% haste when it's fully stacked up during your burst. That trinket is going to proc a lot for them as well. This is awesome for those classes, but for us, it doesn't do enough damage to be better than a Shadow Singed Fang, a Pantheon trinket, or even something like an Eye of Command, or a low Arcano Crystal would beat this trinket out usually. But if you do have a high one, sim it, see if it sims better. It's not terrible, but it's no Shadow Singed Fang, really, is the gist of it. And the last two trinkets in the raid are Forge Fiend's Fabricator and Gorshlack's Legacy. These two suck. They're dog shit. They're trash. They're awful. Disenchant them if you get them. Kind of exaggerating a bit. These are awful, though. They're not very good at all. Now, on to one other topic about trinkets before I skip to the next section of the video, is there's a lot of other trinkets you can get, and because of the Titan Forge system, a lot of trinkets stay relevant throughout the entire expansion. So I'm going to put a link down in the description below, and I'll put the link on the screen now so you guys can see it, to Herodamage.com. It is run by people who you should trust very much on these kind of topics, and you can see an entire comparison chart for all the trinkets that are available so you can see if one is better. I do highly recommend you sim nonetheless, just in case, but that is a good way to see what trinkets are the best. And on that, you're going to see things like Cradle of Anguish, Eye of Command, Chaos Talisman, just the trinkets that have been strong throughout the entire expansion or when they were introduced. So definitely give that a check before you make your final decisions on your trinkets. So now we're on to the rotation/opener portion of the video. So in this portion, I'm going to talk first about the opener. So the opener is fairly simple. The main goal of it is to get an extend on Remorseless Winter. You do get an extend on Remorseless Winter, it increases your damage by a lot. Now, in order to do this, we don't want to overcap too much on runic power, and we also don't want to waste a lot of things. Like, you don't want to waste Empower Rune Weapon. However, it is fine to use it during the opener to make sure that you can keep it running smoothly if you get very unlucky on belt procs and murder sufficiency procs and just general killing machine procs in general. So the goal here is to, of course, get our Remorseless Winter extend via Gathering Storm. For those of you who don't know how that really works, every time you spend a rune, 2 on Obliterate, 1 on Rhyme procs. Yes, Rhyme procs, even though they're free, count as a rune. And Remorseless Winter itself, when you get the extend, do all extended duration of Remorseless Winter. So, of course, Obliterate, even with a killing machine, even with refunds, still gives you a 1 second extend. Rhyme procs give you a 0.5 second extend as well. So we're going to start with our opener, which is going to look like this. It's going to look like Remorseless plus Pillar on pull as we run in. It's going to then be followed up with a couple Obliterates, any Rhyme procs that we get, and also Frost Strike. So you want to use it right as you hit the boss because you don't want to have any downtime on your Remorseless Winter. And if you want to make a macro to bundle these two together for your opener, that's fine. By all means, do that. So I'm going to pre-pot here. I'm going to go right here and then start immediately. So as you can see, I'm maximizing my uptime on Remorseless Winter by doing this. And then I use that there, start with right there. And then I pop that and try to get the extend almost got the extend. So it's very difficult to do outside of Bloodlust. As you can see, I was about 1 second off, and I was overriding some Rhyme procs there because that is very important to do to get the extend. However, you don't always want to do that. I was just trying to get it for the purposes of the video, but it's okay if you don't get it. It's very difficult to do outside of Bloodlust, but still possible. You want to definitely pull for it, and on the opener, it is definitely possible. But right there was very difficult to do. During Lust, you will 100% get the extend if you play it just how we played it now. And I will show a chart on the screen right now to show you the opener, so you guys can refer back to that whenever you want. But now let's talk about the general rotation. So the general rotation is fairly simple. Now the general rotation priority for Frost DKs is pretty simple. Number 1, of course, is if you have Remorseless Winter up, you want to use it. Now the caveat with Remorseless Winter is, let's say I use a couple runes here like that, and my Remorseless Winter comes off cooldown. Now what do? I have Remorseless Winter, I have a killing machine, I have 3 runes. Do I use it right there? Well, what I want to do, since I have a bunch of runic powers, dump some, and then I use my Remorseless. And the reason I do that is because, number 1, I don't want to overcap on runic power. That's very important to not overcap. You're just wasting resources at that point. And also, I want to wait till a couple of other runes came up. Big reason why is because I want to make sure I can get to 10 stacks of Gathering Storm. Remember, Remorseless Winter, you look here, it does a lot of damage. That was 5 to 6% of my damage, and that was just a regular Remorseless Winter outside of Obliteration, where I just barely got the 10 stacks. And that did a lot of damage. So you definitely want to make sure that you're getting to 10 stacks consistently, and that's the way to do it. Now, after Remorseless Winter, Rhyme proc takes priority over killing a machine, over capping runic power, anything. Rhyme procs take over. The reason they take over is because if you do use an Obliterate when you have a Rhyme proc up, you have a chance to overwrite that Rhyme proc. If you use Obliterate and you have a Rhyme proc up, and then Obliterate procs a Rhyme proc, you basically get 1 Rhyme proc even though you could have had 2. So you want to use your Rhyme procs when you get them. So let's say right here, let me try to get a Rhyme proc. I'm just fishing for a Rhyme proc here. I get a Rhyme proc. And I use some other abilities right here. I have a killing machine and I have a Rhyme proc. I use my Rhyme proc and then I use my killing machine, And then I get a rhyme proc later. As you can see, Killing Machine procs rhyme. I don't want to overwrite that. Next up, of course, your next in your priority, and I'm going to put these all on the side of the screen if I haven't already done it. So next up is, of course, your Killing Machine priority. So Killing Machine takes priority over most anything else. And the only time it does, really, is you don't want all your runes to be up. You always want your runes to be on cooldown. So it's not just Killing Machine priority, it's Killing Machine and I have 3 or more runes. Or sorry, 4 or more runes, not 3. 4 or more runes. Because I always want 3 runes off cooldown. As you can see here, you can always have 3 runes on cooldown. Runes take about 7 seconds baseline, and then once your runes come off cooldown, your other runes, as you can see, they have a 13-second timer here. That's because they technically haven't started going on cooldown yet, and then they go on cooldown. You can see the bar start to fill up. So you want to make sure you use your Killing Machine when you have 4 or more runes available. Next up, of course, we have our Frost Strike when you're at about 80 runic power or more. So I wouldn't use it here. Right here, I would, of course, right here use my Killing Machine, but let's pretend I don't have a Killing Machine. I would use my Frost Strike here, and then other things would take priority. And then I'd use my Frost Strike here, and then I use another ability, and then I use my Frost Strike just to make sure I don't over cap on runic power. So that is that. And then, of course, at the end is just basic Obliteration and Frost Strikes. Obliterate does take priority over Frost Strike, simply because Obliterate can proc Rhyme, Obliterate can extend Gathering Storms. It's just more beneficial altogether. And last but not least, when do I use my Sindragosa's Fury on pull? So this is actually kind of a difficult question that I see a lot of people answering with just the wrong choice. So you want to use your Sindragosa's Fury after you've used basically everything else. So if you remember, my rotation, this is going to be a little sloppy. Looks like this. Go in, dump some things. I'm not really going to worry about Gathering Storm here. I'm just going to really worry about that. Use my Obliteration. Still have Pillar Frost going. As you can see, I have 5 seconds left, and I have 8 seconds left of that. And what I'm doing here is I'm basically going for a Pantheon and other procs, and I'm making sure that I do it with 5 Razorite stacks. I'm making sure I get my procs. If you use it right on pull, chances are you're not going to have a Pantheon proc, you're not going to have your Fallen Crusader maybe, you might not have your Concordance. If I wait till later, especially during Lust, you are definitely going to have some buffs up. But you want to use it after Obliteration, you want to use it after you've really done a lot of dumping into your Remorseless Winter, and you want to use it before Pillar ends. That is the most important thing, before Pillar ends. And out of that, we got a 12 mil crit Frost Breath. That's without Pantheon, that's without Pre-Pot. That is a hefty Frost Breath. Now that concludes my 7.3.5 Frost DK Obliteration Guide. Some miscellaneous things. My add-ons and weak auras are available in the description if you like my weak aura setup and you want to use it. I also have a video where I go over each individual part of my weak auras, and I also put my LVOI string up in that video. I'll also put in the description of this video. And if you are interested in a lot of my other content, I recommend you subscribe. I'm going to be doing a lot more content lately after a long break from YouTube, and I do plan on starting to stream soon, so definitely look out for that. My Twitch is down in the description below. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you have any questions, post them down in the comments below. I will get back to all questions that are asked, and have a great day.